I think I was about 18 when I first joined the online dating community. One of my friends had convinced me to sign up since I had just gone through a terrible breakup. I was still technically in high school, but only about 2 months from graduation. As I was clicking through one of the dating sites on my phone, I came across someone who seemed decent looking and fairly normal from what I could tell based on his profile. It said he was the son of a local cop whose name I'll leave out because he's well known here, so we'll call him Officer V, and we'll call his son Ren. Ren had just moved in with his dad from Florida and was looking to meet new people. We chatted online for a while and then decided to meet up and go for a walk. We met up at a local ice cream shop and then walked around the downtown getting to know each other. Now, off the bat after meeting him, I wasn't super into him, but I know nerves get the best of people, so I decided to give it another chance. I was a member of the marching band in high school, and we always did the local parades for Memorial Day and such. Well, Ren and I had been texting all day, talking about meeting up for a picnic or such after I was done with the parades. When I told him we were just finishing up and that I needed to go home and get cleaned up before we went out, that's when things took a turn for the creepy. He insisted on picking me up from the end of the parade, and after 10 minutes of arguing, I finally convinced him that no, he would not pick me up, and would in fact wait for me to change and get cleaned up. After I was done getting changed, I gave him my address, and said he could come pick me up then if he'd like. Not even 3 minutes later, he was outside waiting. When I got into the car, I smelled something awful that can only be described as something rotting and dead. I'm a messy person, but I've never let my car get that gross on the inside, much less let a date see it in that state. There were food wrappers everywhere. Dirty laundry. It really looked as though this guy had been living out of his car. When I asked him what we would be doing for the evening, he said we were going out to dinner, but that he wanted to show me something first. I live very near the third largest national military cemetery in the US, and that's where this kid took me. I would have understood, being as it was Memorial Day, wanting to make a quick stop and pay respect for your family who had passed or those who had served. But no. We drove through the cemetery, and he pointed out every single grave that was even remotely related to him. To make matters worse, it wasn't just this one cemetery. We drove through 4 cemeteries. 4. When we left the last one, I thought the creepiness was over. Boy, was I wrong. We went back to his house and I asked if we were still going to dinner, and he replied with, "Yes, but we'll have to wait for my dad, Officer V. He's taking us." I was a good kid and never got into much trouble, but the thought of being stuck in a restaurant with a cop was just a little unnerving to me. Why hadn't he told me this in the first place? As we were sitting on the couch watching TV, waiting for Officer V to come home, Ren decided that it was a good time to try and make a move on me. He leaned in to kiss me and attempted to say something cute before doing so, but I had to immediately turn my face away because of the awful stench coming from this guy's mouth. I've dated smokers before, and cigarette breath really didn't bother me, but this was cigarette breath on steroids. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Thankfully, moments later, his father walked in and announced he was ready to go to dinner. After a brief few questions about my age, making sure it was okay for him to take me across state lines, not uncommon as I live on the west coast of a state, it's frequent to cross the border into a neighboring state, we left for dinner. For the entire meal, Ren didn't say a single word. Instead, his father, Officer V, asked all of the questions, and I really felt like I was being interrogated. Thankfully, the dinner was short. After the meal, I texted one of my friends and told her I needed a way to get out of this situation, and to call me and pretend to be upset. It turns out Officer V was dating her mother, unbeknownst to me, so Ren knew who she was, quite well in fact. I told Ren I needed to go because my friend was really upset and needed my help. He outright refused to take me back to my car so that I could go alone, even though the only way to get back to her house was to drive directly past mine, where my car was parked. After the argument ensued about him not taking me to my car, he dropped me off at her house, and I immediately jumped out of the car without saying goodbye or thank you. Thinking that he had gotten the hint that I was most certainly not interested, I thought I was in the clear. His tours of the cemeteries and the refusal to take me to my car were huge red flags, so I knew he was not someone I wanted in my life. I blocked him on the dating site and deleted his number. The following weeks got progressively creepier. He would continually text me and call me, even though he knew I wouldn't answer. He would come to the baseball games I worked at and just watch, and a few times I had to have the coach throw him out because he was bothering us. He even called me once, and my friend answered the phone and blatantly told him that I was not interested and to stop calling. He never got the hint. The calls and texts continued for weeks, and I would notice him drive by my house sometimes. I only ever ran into him once after that, at a local bar and pizza shop. I was at the bar with friends when I had noticed him come in. As he came up behind me to talk to me, I turned my head and clearly ignored him, and acted as though I had neither seen or heard him. After a few minutes of waiting, he walked away, and I have not seen or heard from him since. My friend often tells me how creepy he still is, as her mother and Officer V are now married. Word is, Ren recently got married too. I feel so bad for that poor girl, but I hope he isn't such a creep to her like he was to me. I'm a first-time poster, and I joined Reddit just to share this story. So I'm a photojournalist in a pretty big city in the Midwest. Several years ago, when I was fresh out of college, I spent the winter doing a personal project on the homeless community in the city. Several weeks into working on the story, I started spending a lot of time documenting a sizable homeless camp. It was under an interstate overpass and near a train yard, which conveniently was just over a mile from my apartment. I got to know a lot of the people who stayed there pretty well, and never really felt threatened. Except once. Throughout my time there, I knew who did and didn't mind getting their picture taken, and whoever didn't want me snapping pics of them, I generally left them alone. There was this one guy named Jay, who was camped a little farther away from the main camp than the rest. I never bothered him. Some of the other residents had told me that he was mentally ill, or that he was hooked on meth, and that it was best to just leave him alone. I said fine and just decided to stay away from him. One day, I was staying after dark to photograph a church bringing food to the camp. Jay had shown up that evening to get some of the food. I ignored him and concentrated on photographing the others. It was starting to get dark, and the church group was packing up to leave. I noticed at this point that Jay was still around, and he was shooting me these really mean glares. He also seemed to be following me around the area while I worked, staring at me. Once everyone had went back to the camp, however, he was gone. A few hours later, I leave to head back to my apartment. I was really tired, and one of the shortcuts to my apartment from the camp was to walk a little ways up the railroad tracks and cut through a path that wound through a tree line and came out by my apartment building. I was about halfway up the tracks to the path, where there was a decent amount of light from a highway that ran parallel to the tracks, when I realized there's someone following me. I turn around and sure enough, it's Jay. He was about 30 feet from me, and I jumped out of my skin at the realization that this dude had been following me, and I hadn't noticed. Not really knowing what to do, I just blurted out, "Oh, hey dude," and this dialogue ensued.
"Hey, did you take my picture earlier?"
"No, I don't think so."
"I'm pretty sure you took my picture."
"No, I really don't think I did, man, unless you were in the background."
"So, did you take my picture?"
"I said I didn't, dude."
"Oh yeah? Well, let me see your camera. I think you're full of shit."
At this point, I started walking backwards because he was advancing menacingly towards me. No offense, man, but I don't let other people touch my camera.
So, you did take my picture.
At this point, Jay just starts screaming and accusing me of taking his picture. He demands that I show him all of my photos, and I refuse because, no shit, I'm not handing a $6,000 camera to a dude in a state of rage. After a few minutes, he goes from yelling at me to some sort of psychotic fit and starts screaming this enraged babble. He starts closing the distance between us. I turn to bolt, and he lunges at me. Luckily, Jay wasn't a big dude. I'm about 6'1" and have a full contact karate background, so I instinctively pop him one and then vault. He chases after me for a few seconds, just shrieking this garbled nonsense. Then, once I get into a light near the path, I look behind, and he's gone. I was shaken but relieved, so I quickly made my way back to my apartment. I open the door, and I'm safely inside, and literally the instant it closes, it was a door that opened into the apartment, so you had to push. Jay smashes into it like a fucking truck. Luckily, the door had latched, but he nearly knocked the entire frame out. I hit the floor, dropping my camera to the ground. No damage to the gear. That's a Nikon D3S and 3.5 f2 for you. Then scramble up the stairs and into my apartment. All the while, Jay is screaming crazy nonsense shit and punching and kicking at the door. I call the cops and they come, and Jay's nowhere to be found. I just told them I heard someone trying to break into the building forcefully. I guess I was naive, but I figured it would just fuck up my project if the cops turned up at the camp where several people were active users. Turns out, homeboy Jay wasn't just punching the door. There were marks where clearly some sort of edged tool was being used. I really bet it was a railroad spike, because several other people at the camp would keep spikes with them for protection, and those tracks were littered with them. Anyways, I didn't go back to those tracks for a really long time, but I ran into one of the other people who had been staying there, and told them about what had happened. Ends up, shortly after this incident, Jay skipped town. Not even a week later, the cops came by the camp with his mugshot. It turns out he was wanted for almost beating another homeless person to death in another city. I guess that would explain why he was so paranoid about his picture being taken. My bad is that he hopped on a train and rolled the rails out, and is somewhere else farther south. Or honestly, hopefully he's dead, because I never want to meet that motherfucker again. This happened in the mid-90s. I was about 5 years old, and my family decided to go on a trip to Fiji over spring break. My parents, aunts, and uncles grew up there, so we weren't solely there as tourists. The first few days we stayed with relatives and got the local experience, which was a lot of fun, honestly. It was mine and my older brother's first time there. There were a big group of us visiting. Me, my brother, a handful of our cousins around the same age, and all of our parents. I was the youngest of the group. After visiting relatives, the adults decided to rent a beachside house for the remainder of the trip. We were all really excited about the view and being so close to the beach. The house was really big too. To this day, it's the biggest and nicest house I've ever had the chance to stay in. Anyway, we swam, hiked, sat around a bonfire, and did all the usual outdoorsy stuff. The first night was so much fun, and it's so deeply ingrained into my memory. The second night, however, the adults decided to go out for a few hours and leave the older kids to take care of us younger ones. They said they weren't going to be gone long. They said they would be coming back at 10 o'clock at the very latest, and the house had a security system installed, so no one was really worried about anything happened. Plus, this was back in the 90s. Being the oldest of the kids at 17, my brother was left in charge. We had 3 cousins with us. 2 boys, 11 and 15 respectively, and 1 girl who was also 15. I was rooming with my female cousin, and the boys were rooming together, while the adults had their own private rooms, so I was the youngest by a long shot. Anyway, us kids decided to go down to the beach while the sun was still out, an hour or 2 at max. We packed all our beach gear and took off. The house was still in view at this point, and we didn't stray too far away. We were basically just in the backyard. My female cousin, Joanna, didn't let me out of her sight. In fact, she stayed with me and built sandcastles the entire time. We took a bunch of pictures on her disposable camera, some of which are still tacked onto her fridge all these years later. We're still really close, and I look after her young daughter all the time. So the older boys swam out and did their thing, while Joanna, Eric, 11, and I stayed behind and played on the beach. Our original plan of staying out for only an hour or 2 soon turned into 3. It was only as the water became a little too aggressive that we decided to finally go back to the house. Because my brother's an idiot, he forgot the key to the back door in his room, so we had to use the front door of the house, which required walking all the way around the gate and down the dirt road out front. We packed up our shit and took off, the 5 of us. It was pretty dark at this point. Joanna and I held hands the entire way. Eric was walking with us, while my brother brought up the rear and my older cousin Dean took the lead in front. We kept quiet while we were walking back, all being extremely tired from being out all day. Joanna and my brother exchanged a few words here and there. I was so tired though. I had no idea what they were saying, and at this point I didn't care. My only concern was sleep and Game Boy. It was only as Dean slowed to a halt in front of us that I realized something was wrong. There was a man walking towards us from the other side of the dirt road. I was very young at the time, but I remember the look on this man's face very clearly. He was old, Caucasian and very tan, adorned in typical male tourist attire, consisting of a tropical shirt, cargo shorts, sandals, and a straw hat. His clothes were straight out of a tropical getaway catalog. There were other houses in the area being rented out by people, so we all just figured he was in a neighboring property walking home or something. Even so, my brother cut in front of Joanna, Eric, and I just in case, and slowed at the same time the man did. The man introduced himself as Eddie and said that he was lost, looking for directions to the house he was staying in. He appeared to be heavily under the influence, kind of glassy-eyed and wobbly, like he couldn't stand perfectly still. There was some swaying, and for whatever reason, his eyes went directly to Joanna. He would periodically look at her while my brother was giving him directions. It was around this time that Joanna, who had been holding my hand, squeezed my tiny fingers inside her slightly bigger ones. I could tell that she was nervous. Even then, at 5 years old, I sensed that there was something seriously wrong with the way this man was looking at her. Eric, who up until that point had ignored me the whole trip because he wanted to look cool in front of the other boys, took my other hand, and the 3 of us stood together like a shaky wall behind Dean and my brother. I couldn't really hear the words that were being exchanged. I just saw my brother gesturing as he was giving directions, pointing his arm back, to the left, and whichever way. This lasted about 5 minutes before we were on our way again. My brother made sure to walk beside Eddie for a minute, all the way past our shaky wall, and then he waved by and we all carried on to our house. The older kids exchanged a look with each other but didn't say anything. In fact, we didn't speak of Eddie at all. We entered the house, showered, and met in the kitchen for something to eat. My brother cooked for us and we sat around the table, talking about how much fun the beach was. And then we heard a knock at the front door. Expecting it to be our parents, we didn't really think anything of it. The older kids were too lazy to get up and answer it, but Dean eventually caved. He went to the door, and I, being a curious 5-year-old, went with him. There were windows and a peephole on the door where Dan could have looked, but he decided not to. He unlocked the door and opened it, and his body language turned rigid as his eyes met with Eddie. Within seconds, Dean was on the defense, and he glanced back, motioning for me to go away and grab my brother. I waited a couple of seconds before doing it, catching Eddie as he asked Dean if he could use the phone in the house. Apparently he was too far away, and the walk was killing his legs, so he wanted to call a cab. This was before the age of everyone and their mother having a cell phone, so showing up at someone's doorstep and asking to use their phone wasn't terribly out of the ordinary. I skittered off to the kitchen and motioned for my brother to follow me. I guess he saw the mildly anxious look on my eyes, so he immediately dropped his food onto his plate and went to the door. Like Dean, his body also went rigid when he saw Eddie. And the three of them spoke at the door for a long time, Eddie begging to use the phone while Dean and my brother said they couldn't let him inside. And they said if he really wanted to use it, he should wait until the adults came home and ask them instead. By telling him this, however, they had let the fact slip that us kids were home alone. They must have been going at it for at least 10 minutes, and by this time, Joanna came out to see what was happening. I remember her rocking back when she saw Eddie at the door, breath catching in her chest. She glanced down at me and nodded for me to join Eric in the kitchen. I usually wouldn't have listened, but that night I did. I went back to the kitchen and told Eric what was going on at the door. Even though he was older than me, he used to get scared really easily. To this day, he's still very jumpy when it comes to horror movies and things. For this reason, he swallowed the dry lump in his throat and yanked me back when I took off to see what was going on. Sometime later, Joanna and Dean returned to the kitchen without my brother. I raced past them, poking my head around the corner to see that he had let Eddie inside the house, standing with him as he used the phone. It was attached to the long wall in the long hallway. My brother leaned against the wall and kept his attention firmly on Eddie as the man dialed the number for the cab company and called one to our address. This took about a minute, after which Eddie thanked my brother and waved bye to me on his way out. My brother kept the front door open, standing there and watching for a solid 20 minutes or so until the cab arrived and drove Eddie away in the back seat. Our parents came home maybe 10 minutes later, a car full of groceries in the trunk. As per my brother's request, we decided not to tell our parents about Eddie. If they knew we let a stranger inside use the phone, they would have blown their shit. Rightfully, but still. We were kids, and my brother just tried to sort out the situation the best he could. Plus, Eddie didn't really do anything, per se. There was just something about him that was odd. The rest of the night went without a hitch. In fact, 2 nights went by without anything weird happening. By this point, we had all forgotten about Eddie. At least, I had. Joanna, on the other hand, kept a kitchen knife under her pillow just in case. I had no idea at the time because she told me about this years later. On the 4th night at this house, the adults cracked open the barbecue outside, and we had a little cookout in the back. It was a really good time. There was good food, cold drinks, a deadly game of Monopoly, and even a little bit of storytelling from my slightly inebriated uncle. My parents told me I could stay up late with everyone and everything, which I hadn't been allowed to do the entire time we were there thus far. Suffice it to say, we were all having a good night. The stars were out, the waves were crashing softly on the shore, and the mosquitoes were biting the fuck out of us. My mother went inside to grab some repellent, and didn't return until a couple of minutes later. She went straight to my father after, without the insect repellent, and whispered something to him, a weary look on her face. The others noticed too. She told them some strange man was at the front door, knocking repeatedly. My father and my sober uncle went out to check what all the fuss was about. They answered the door, asked Eddie what he wanted, who, to my memory, kept saying, "My buddy Will said I could swing by. Can I talk to my buddy?" Will is my brother's name. I kept thinking it was weird, the fact that he kept referring to my brother as his buddy. The adults found it very weird too. My father asked Eddie what he wanted, and why he wanted to talk to my brother. He just kept saying that Will was his buddy, and that he wanted to see him. He was very clearly on something. Drugs, alcohol, I don't know. There was just something wrong with him. Eventually, Eddie said that he needed to use the phone again, and that Will had let him use it last time. The jig was up. My father glanced back at Will as he came out to see what was going on, and gave him the death look. The boy you done fucked up kind of look. He knew better than to let strangers in the house. But that was the thing. Eddie had a way about him. He was odd, but at the same time kind of disarming. You didn't know whether you wanted to knock him out or help him out. My father and uncle told Eddie he couldn't use the phone, but they did give him directions to the nearest convenience store where he could ask for directions and find proper help. Eddie kept trying to persuade them to let him into our house to use the phone, but they firmly told him he had to leave, shutting the door in his face immediately after. Sometime later, we all went to bed. Joanna and I stayed up a little later, and she read me a chapter out of the YA novel she had been reading the whole trip. It was Flowers in the Attic, in case you're curious. Certainly not the most appropriate novel for a child of 5, but I had no idea what half of it meant anyways. In any case, I fell asleep, and a few hours later I woke up to the sound of Joanna's voice. She shook me awake, and said that we had to hide in the bathroom for a little bit. The look in her eyes was wide and full of fear, and without her telling me directly, I knew this was about Eddie. She took me by the hand and we locked ourselves in the bathroom. I noticed she kept touching the back pocket of her jeans, but I didn't know why. I later found out she had tucked the knife in there, and felt for it every few seconds to make sure she still had it. We were hiding for an hour, until we finally heard the police. I remember hearing their loud footsteps in the house, and I remember Joanna opening the door for them when they knocked on the bathroom to see where we were. I didn't know it then, but apparently Eddie had come to the house again while we were sleeping. The boys' room was really warm that night, so the 3 of them had left the window open. Apparently, Eddie had hovered by the window a second and quietly climbed inside. Eric, the poor guy. He was the first one who saw him and screamed bloody murder, waking up Dean and my brother. Eddie's eyes were bloodshot, and he was twitching all over the place, climbing in and asking his buddy to help him find the sweet girl from the other night. He was referring to Joanna. Every screw in his head was loose, and he began laughing, shouting and telling my brother they could take turns on her, amongst other obscene things all at the same time. It's like he couldn't decide if he was horny or angry. According to my brother and everyone else who restrained and held Eddie down that night, there was something incredibly off about him, other than the fact that he had broken into the house. The way he was talking, it was so delusional, as though he was fully convinced that Will was really his friend, and that Joanna was really going to be his that night. It was really terrifying. To this day, my brother doesn't talk at all about it. He's the only one who refuses to recount his full version of the story. I think it had something to do with Eddie really, truly thinking they were old buds, who had promised each other they would use Joanna like a rag doll. This man was so fucking convinced. Anyway, their screaming woke up the adults, and my mother called the police right away, while my father and my 2 uncles held Eddie down until the cops got there. Joanna's mother raced upstairs and woke the girl up, telling her to grab me and hide until further notice. We had no idea if Eddie had come alone, but we were pretty convinced. My mother checked if all the other windows and doors were locked, and she took Eric upstairs and waited with him in the hallway, trying to calm him down while the cops drove up. It turns out, Eddie had some severe mental problems. He had become obsessed with Joanna after he first saw her. She was exactly his type. Young, of color, and unwilling. We later found out Joanna wasn't the only girl he had harassed on the trip, but she was the only one whose house he had snuck into in search of her. Who knows what would have happened if he'd climbed through our window instead of the boys'. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. And just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. I know I've been apologizing a lot lately because the production schedule has been a little off whack, but that's because I recently went back to school, so things have been a little bit hectic for these first few days. But rest assured, we're going to be picking up the schedule again here pretty soon, and there's not going to be any more like 4-day waits between videos, so don't worry about that kind of stuff. If you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave feedback in the comments below, or perhaps like, share, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any personal stories that you'd like to send in, or if you ever just want to chat, go ahead and take a look in the description. There will be links to all of my social media, including Facebook, Twitter, and Gmail. You can go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to include your story in a video or respond as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is, the theme, if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If any of you are ever curious about the music used in the videos, the music is always listed in the description below. It's listed in the order it appears in the video, by name, and I also have links to the artists as well if you'd like to check out more of their work. So if you're ever curious about the music, just go ahead and check down there in the description. Last but not least, as always, if you have any constructive criticism, please feel free to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day.